A Listener's Guide to Johann Sebastian Bach's St. John Passion. I'm Dr. Kent Cleland, Professor of Music Theory at the Baldwin Wallace Conservatory of Music. The St. John Passion is one of Johann Sebastian Bach's best-known and most emotionally affective large-scale choral orchestral works. It is a musically dramatic presentation of the Passion story as told in Martin Luther's translation of the Gospel of John, enhanced with poetic commentary by other authors, and intended as a nearly complete Good Friday Lutheran church service. The piece was composed from 1723 to 1724, just after Bach had been appointed to his final professional position as cantor at the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig. Like much of Bach's music, the piece disappeared into obscurity following his death, until being rediscovered as part of the Bach Renaissance of the early 19th century. Since that time, it has become a staple in the choral orchestral literature. This is the story of that work. In 1723, Johann Sebastian Bach accepted an offer to become the cantor at the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig. For a church musician, this represented one of the most prestigious positions available in 18th century Germany, and carried with it significant and varied responsibilities. As cantor, Bach not only had to play the organ and train and direct the choirs at Leipzig's two largest churches, St. Thomas and St. Nicholas, but he was also responsible for coordinating musical resources at Leipzig's two other churches and teaching Latin to young boys at St. Thomas's affiliated school. Most significantly, Bach was responsible for coordinating music for the weekly services at St. Thomas and St. Nicholas, music which not only ought to bring prestige to the city, but also should educate and elevate the citizenry of Leipzig who were required to attend weekly services. This carried with it the expectation that much, perhaps most, of the weekly music would be newly composed works. Bach had never before held a position that required the sheer volume of composition required in this new job. Special days in the liturgical calendar required special music. For example, Good Friday, the Christian observance of the crucifixion and death of Jesus, required the setting of a passion, a telling of the story of Jesus' last days, from his arrival in Jerusalem through his crucifixion and death. The expected method of presenting this story had, over time, evolved, so that audiences of the time were accustomed to hearing an oratorio passion, a dramatic setting of the passion story using named characters, choruses, orchestral accompaniment, and operatic arias. Even Bach's predecessor in Leipzig, the notoriously conservative Johann Kuhnau, had begun to use this genre in recent years. Passion settings of the time were generally based on the presentation of the story from one of the four Gospels of the Christian Bible. Each of these tellings differs in tone, emphasis, and detail, resulting in a diverse array of source material from which a composer could draw. The standard Passion format of the time generally consisted of a setting of the specific gospel text with additional poetic commentary intended not only to teach the events of the story, but also to provide some instruction as to its meaning. Bach is thought to have composed 5 Passion settings, based on a description in a 1754 obituary co-written by his son Carl Philipp Emanuel and his student Johann Friedrich Agricola. Scholars believe that the earliest Passion setting was from his time as organist and Kapellmeister at the court of Weimar, where he served from 1708 until 1717. This work is lost, but sections of it most likely were reused in Bach's later Passion settings. In Leipzig, Bach is thought to have composed 4 Passions, a complete cycle, with one composed for each of the Gospel accounts. The first was the St. John in 1724, with the larger and better-known St. Matthew Passion being composed 3 to 5 years later. An incomplete score of a St. Luke Passion, partly in Bach's hand, exists, but scholars are fairly certain that the music is not the work of Bach. Text exists for a St. Mark Passion, performed in 1731, but music to this work has been lost, with the complete score last having been documented as existing in 1764. Of the 5 passions mentioned in the C.P.E. Bach Agricola obituary, only the St. John and St. Matthew still exist. The St. John Passion was Bach's first large-scale choral work after his appointment in Leipzig. Bach almost certainly set out to impress his new employers with a work of intense emotion and power. For Bach, this would have been the largest work, both in length and scale, that he had yet composed, launching him compositionally into a period of composing several of his most noted choral orchestral works. The St. John Passion was performed 4 times during Bach's life, at its premiere on Good Friday, April 7, 1724, at the St. Nicholas Church in Leipzig, in a revised form a year later in 1725 at St. Thomas, another, more revised version in 1732, and once in the early 1740s. A 1739 performance was cancelled and replaced by another work when Bach became angry at changes required by the Leipzig City Council. Of these various versions of the work, the 1724 version is generally considered by scholars and performers to be the most authentic, and is likewise the most commonly performed. Most of Bach's revisions for the various later versions were intended to address criticisms by church or city officials. It is telling that the final revision, in 1749, as Bach's health was failing and he worked fervently to set definitive versions of many of his works, restored the musical structure and movements of the 1724 version, updating only the size of the orchestra and the choral forces required to perform it. The work's structure was intended to be used in an actual Lutheran Good Friday service. It is divided into 2 parts. Part 1 begins with Jesus' addressing his disciples at the garden at Gethsemane and finishes with Simon Peter's 3rd denial of Jesus. Part 2 continues the story, commencing with his testimony before Pontius Pilate, progressing through his crucifixion and death, and concluding with the placing of his body in its tomb. A sermon would have separated the 2 parts. Bach utilizes 4 types of musical textures, each with a specific dramatic function. Recitatives presented by soloists, and choral sections present the actual setting of Martin Luther's translation of the Book of John, chapters 18 and 19. Solo arias serve to provide educational and interpretive commentary by setting poetic texts, altered slightly by Bach, taken from Jesus Tortured and Dying for the Sins of the World of 1712 by Hamburg senator and Renaissance man Barthold Heinrich Brockus, poetry by Christian Heinrich Postel, a Hamburg poet and librettist, and texts taken from I Follow Thee Also, from Thoughts Necessary to Innocent Youth by Christian Weisse, a Saxon poet and playwright. Chorales, most likely sung only by the choir but very recognizable to the congregation as hymns they would hear and sing frequently in church, provide simplified commentary, bringing the ultimate message of Christ's sacrifice for each individual's redemption home in a very understandable, personal, and comforting way, and a beginning and ending chorus, bringing the ultimate message of Christ's sacrifice for each individual's redemption home in a very understandable, personal, and comforting way. What results is a work that not only faithfully presents the story as told in the Lutheran Bible, but also provides layers of commentary on different intellectual and emotional levels to an audience of diverse educational and social backgrounds. Bach consistently returns to particular themes throughout this work. The voluntary fulfillment of scriptural promises by Jesus, which ultimately leads to redemption of the world through self-sacrifice, portrayals of Jesus' divinity and God's love as the primary motivator for the Passion, the gift of Jesus' sacrifice for all of humanity, and the tension between the necessary strictness of the law and the mercy of the gospel. On April 7, 1724, the priest at the St. Nicholas Church would have intoned the traditional commencement of the Lutheran service. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He then would have been seated, and the presentation of the Passion would have begun. The work begins with one of only two pieces in which the chorus is not acting as a character in the drama by presenting a part of the biblical text. This text comes from an anonymous source, possibly written by Bach himself, and serves as an introduction to the story that the congregation is about to hear, setting the mood and presenting Bach's central themes. The music is in G minor and is set in a three-part ABA form, with the final section being a literal repetition of the opening. An extended orchestral section opens the work, comprised of a complex combination of three simple elements. First, the pedal point in the bass. Second, the wandering, almost searching figuration in the strings. And, finally, the stinging dissonances and descending chromatic lines in the winds. These three elements combine to establish a texture of anxious anticipation that foreshadow the depiction of Jesus' pain, about which the oratorio is set. The chorus enters in block chords with the first line of text, "Lord, O Lord, whose fame in every land is glorious." The middle section of this movement alternates between contrapuntal phrases and the opening texture. It is as if the dark foreboding can never truly be ignored, and it insistently will not go away. Bach composes a hidden message through one of the primary melodic motives of the movement. The pitches D, E flat, G, C, pronounced in German D, S, G, C, stands for the Latin phrase Deo soli gloria Christus, honor only to God, the Christ. The first scene consists of four pieces. It opens with a series of recitatives and choral responses that present the opening of the Gospel of John, chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. St. John the Evangelist, set as a tenor, presents most of the narration in a recitative texture, interrupted by the chorus, representing the crowd of Pharisees, chief priests, and their servants. Bach consistently lets the characters speak for themselves, as Jesus is represented by a bass voice who sings his lines within the recitative texture. Den mir mein Vater gegeben hat, den Kelch. Jesus is addressing his disciples at the Garden of Cedron, when Judas brings the Pharisees and high priests, armed, to capture him. Jesus asks twice, "Whom do you seek?" To which the crowd replies, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus acknowledges that it is him who they seek, and instructs the crowd to take him and to let his disciples go. The music shifts back and forth between C Dorian, an older scale that is similar to the minor scale, and G minor. Throughout the work, Bach uses traditional Lutheran chorales to interrupt, provide commentary, and allow for reflection on the biblical text. The second piece in the scene is the first of these 11 chorale settings that occur throughout the work. These are simple tunes that would have been recognizable to the congregation, as they would have been sung in church several times each year. In Bach's time, the congregation likely would have just listened to these chorales rather than singing along. This opening chorale is the 7th verse of Johann Hermann's 1630 setting of Herzliebster Jesus, was hast du verbrochen? Or, Dearest Jesus, what have you done wrong? Set in the first scene's home key of G minor. This verse acknowledges Jesus' sacrifice for the individual Christian's soul. The scene continues with another recitative that depicts Simon Peter drawing a sword and striking off the ear of one of the high priest's servants in an attempt to protect Jesus, followed by Jesus' rebuke of this action. Bach begins to move away from his home key, moving to the more distantly related F Mixolydian, an old scale with similarities to major, which sets up a move to D minor for the last piece in the scene, and the F major beginning of scene 2. Another chorale setting brings the scene to a close, this time verse 4 of Martin Luther's Vater unser in Himmelreich, Our Father in Heaven, of 1539. The chorale talks about the inevitability of God's will and the need for one's obedience to it. Scene 2 is almost double the length of the opening scene, consisting of 9 pieces and setting chapters 12 through 27 of John chapter 18. Jesus has been taken by the crowd to the home of Annas, father-in-law to the high priest Caiaphas, who is the first to interrogate Jesus about being the king of the Jews, and then to the high priest himself for further questioning. The action is a musical depiction of 2 parallel story tracks: the interrogation of Jesus and Simon Peter's foretold 3 denials of Jesus as he awaits outside with soldiers and servants. The scene begins with a brief recitative that describes the new setting and how the characters arrived at that place. While Bach uses chorales to reflect on the biblical story in a way that is both personal and familiar to the individual seated in the congregation, he also includes arias that provide reflection and commentary on the story and its meaning. Bach provides the first of these before the true action of scene 2 begins. The beautiful alto aria, Von den Stricken meiner Sünden, from the bonds of my sins, uses a text from the poetic passion of Johann Brahms. Set in D minor and 3/4 time, the text begins to describe the central Christian message of Jesus' sacrifice through depicting the opposing images of Jesus being bound so that one may be released from the bonds of his or her sin, and Jesus being wounded to heal the wounds of the individual. The music begins with a striking introduction consisting of an ornamented ascending line in the continuo set against an imitative figure in the oboes that clearly recalls the stinging dissonances of the opening chorus of the work. A series of dissonant tones that surround the actual consonant goal tone of the phrase seems to be a musical depiction of the knots of which the soloist sings. The aria is set in a modified ABA form with several liberties taken with the melody in the repeat of the A section, presumably introduced both to ornament the melody and to follow Bach's key plan for the movement. The aria ends with a repetition of the instrumental introduction. A very brief recitative states that Simon Peter followed Jesus to the house of Annas and leads to a second aria, this time for soprano, which expands on this theme of following Jesus. Set to a text by an anonymous librettist, Ich folge dir gleichfalls, or I follow you gladly, establishes a pattern in the work for presenting arias in pairs. Set in B-flat major, a third below the previous aria, and in 3/8 time, this aria also is set in an ABA form, with melodic modifications to the repeat of the opening section. The text speaks of following Jesus in gladness and asks that he continue to lead and urge the listener in his way. The oboes of the previous aria are replaced by 2 flutes whose obligato melody suggests the word follow through their repetition. The bright B-flat tonality contrasts with the darker D minor of the aria that preceded it. In addition, Bach contrasts the depiction of the law from the first aria, set a strict counterpoint, with the grace of the gospel by utilizing much freer contrapuntal writing in this second aria. The scene begins in earnest in the form of an extended recitative involving multiple characters: the evangelist, a maid and a servant, the disciple Simon Peter, and Jesus. First, Simon Peter is asked by the maid whether he is with Jesus, which Simon Peter denies. The scene then shifts inside where the high priest questions Jesus about his teachings. Taking Jesus' answer as disrespectful, a servant strikes Jesus' cheek, rebuking him for his tone. Again, following Jesus suffering some physical harm at the hands of his captors, Bach presents a chorale that reflects on how his suffering was for all Christians. This chorale presents verses 3 and 4 of Paul Gerhardt's 1647 hymn, O Welt, sieh hier dein Leben, O world, see here your life. The text speaks of Jesus' perfect, unsinful nature and contrasts it with the individual's sins. The scene continues with Jesus being bound and taken away to the palace of the high priest Caiaphas. As he is being taken, Simon Peter is asked by a soldier whether he is with Jesus, and Simon Peter denies Jesus a second time. Pressed, Simon Peter is asked again and denies Jesus a third time, at which point a rooster crows, fulfilling the prophecy from the Last Supper mentioned in other Gospels, but curiously absent from the Gospel of John, that Simon Peter would 3 times deny Jesus before the rooster crows. For some reason that remains unknown, Bach felt it important to include this detail in his St. John Passion, and borrows from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 26, verse 75, to complete the piece. Bach's setting also includes 2 interesting elements. First, the musical depiction of the rooster crowing to usher in the morning, and second, the musical depiction of Peter's weeping, depicted by a long vocal melisma over a descending chromatic line in the bass. Bach lingers on this moment through presentation of another aria, this time for tenor. Ach, mein Sinn, or Alas, my conscience, set to a text by Hamburg poet Christian Weisse, reflects on Peter's shame at having denied Jesus and his inability to hide from it. The fast tempo and constant jagged rhythms musically reflect Peter's agitation, as do the less clear form and shift to the distant key of F sharp minor, again a third below the key of the previous aria. The scene and act come to a close with a final chorale, verse 10 of Jesu Leiden, Pein und Tod, Jesus' suffering, pain, and death, by Paulus Stockmann of 1633. This verse directly addresses the emotional implications of Peter's denial of Jesus and asks for Jesus' grace when one refuses to repent for evil deeds. These last moments of the scene seem to be serving as a sort of reminder or warning to the listener, through music, of the ramifications one experiences for denying Jesus. This ends the first part of the Passion. At this point in the service, the priest would have given his Good Friday sermon, generally a commentary on the message of Jesus' sacrifice and of personal redemption. The sermon likely would have lasted at least 45 minutes, and would have been viewed by the religious and town authorities as the central focus of the service, presented to provoke repetition of its themes and central ideas in each congregant's home throughout the coming days. The second part of the Passion begins with a chorale, verse 1 of Michael Pretorius's Christus der uns selig macht, Christ who makes us blessed, of 1607. This text is essentially a summary of what befell Jesus in the Passion story, and acts as a sort of entr'acte, re-establishing the mood and reminding the listener of the progression of the story which is now being resumed. Act 2 is divided into 3 scenes: the interrogation by Pontius Pilate, the crucifixion, and the events at the burial site. Scene 1 sets the book of John, chapter 18, verses 28 through chapter 19, verse 17, and consists of 10 pieces. This section of text represents the most controversial part of the Passion in its portrayal and blaming of the Jews for Jesus' crucifixion. Bach's setting of the scene is consistent with the attitudes toward Judaism that existed in central Germany in his time, and many modern listeners find discomfort at this portrayal. While it is important to note that Johann Sebastian Bach and this work are a product of a time and place where anti-Semitism was not only common but also institutionalized, that Bach was likely composing the viewpoint of the powers that be out of a certain amount of ignorance, as Jews were forbidden to live in Saxony during most of his lifetime, it is also appropriate for the modern listener to feel the discomfort at the work's portrayal and message. That Bach was a master composer who set the Passion story with emotional power and musical skill is beyond question. This scene in particular should be troubling for the modern listener and should make us uncomfortable. Many modern performances are accompanied by panel discussions and lectures about anti-Semitism in Bach's time, and the scant evidence on Bach's attitudes toward Judaism in an effort to soften, explain, or apologize for the offending elements of the work. It is beyond the scope of this video to judge the appropriateness of continued performances of the work in light of its portrayal of the Jews in this scene. It is appropriate, however, to point out this portrayal and to ask that each individual reflect not only on the nature of it, but also on how they will address it in their lives. Act 2, Scene 1 takes the form of an extended recitative in which Pontius Pilate asks the crowd about the charges they bring against Jesus, and the crowd insistently demands his crucifixion under Roman law, despite Pilate's repeated claims that he finds no fault in Jesus, and his repeated attempts to find a way to set Jesus free. First, Pilate asks the crowd to judge Jesus under Jewish law, to which the crowd responds that, under their law, they may not put anyone to death, implying that death is the goal that was predetermined by the high priests. Pilate asks Jesus whether he is king of the Jews, to which Jesus responds with a question: "Do you say this of yourself, or have others said this of me?" Pilate asks Jesus what he has done to be turned over to him for punishment, and Jesus responds with his message of his kingdom being not of this world. Bach interrupts the scene with another chorale reflection on Jesus' words. Taken from verses 8 and 9 of Hermann's Herzliebster Jesus, was hast du verbrochen, the same chorale from Act 1, Scene 1, this text asks rhetorically how one may sufficiently proclaim his or her love for Jesus, suggesting that no words or action can possibly be adequate. The scene continues with Pilate's interrogation of Jesus, after which he addresses the crowd again, proclaiming that he can find no fault in Jesus and asking whether Jesus can be released. The crowd, however, insistently refuses, asking instead for the release of the murderer Barabbas. Pilate then orders the beginning of Jesus' scourging, or physical punishment. Once again, as Jesus is physically harmed, Bach interrupts the story to present reflective commentary. This time it takes the form of 2 arias. The first, for bass, is a setting in E-flat major, again a third below the key of the previous aria, of a hybrid text taken from Brachus and Johann Postel. The aria asks the listener to contemplate the good that comes from Jesus' suffering. Betrachte mein Seele is set in E-flat major, a key with special liturgical significance for Bach, with a strikingly different instrumentation. Rather than the orchestral instruments that have been used throughout the work so far, Bach sets this aria for two viola d'amores, an older form of string instrument with a softer and more intimate sound, lute, and continuo. What results is a somewhat archaic sound even for Bach's time. The form of the aria is, once again, not clear following the text of the poetry, and the melody line has some extremely intense and beautifully difficult chromaticism, especially as Bach sets the text that describes Jesus' suffering. This aria is followed by another aria, this time for tenor, Erwäge, wie sein blutgefärbter Rücken, or Consider How His Blood-Stained Back, creates a metaphor between the physical signs of Jesus' suffering with the beauty of what it represents. Set in C minor, another shift of a third and the relative key of the preceding aria, and in 12/8 time, this piece has a clearly more identifiable ABA form. Bach retains the two viola d'amores, and although most modern performances retain the lute, the score gives no indication that it is to remain a part of the instrumentation. Again, the pair of arias present a contrast between the strict interpretation of the law, as represented by strict counterpoint, and the grace of the gospel, as represented by a freer contrapuntal language. The scene continues with the scourging of Jesus by the Roman soldiers, first by placing the crown of thorns upon his head and a purple mantle on his back, then through mockingly calling him the King of the Jews, then by striking his cheek. Once more, Pilate addresses the crowd and states that he finds no fault in Jesus, bringing the injured Jesus out with him for the crowd to see. The crowd screams, "Crucify him!" and Pilate tells the crowd to do it themselves. The crowd responds that it is against their law. Pilate takes Jesus back inside and continues the interrogation, searching for a means of releasing Jesus. The scene is again interrupted with a chorale. This chorale differs from the others, however, in that it does not appear to come from Lutheran liturgy, being composed for this work to poetry by Johann Pastel, and set to a melody by North German Renaissance composer Johann Hermann Schein. Structurally, this chorale appears to have special significance, as Bach treats it as the focal point of this and the following scene, building a symmetrical structure of recitatives, arias, choruses, and chorales around it. The scene continues with a series of recitatives and choruses in which the crowd beseeches the reluctant Pilate to crucify Jesus under Roman law, to which he accedes. The evangelist sings, "Then he delivered him to be crucified. They took Jesus and led him away, and he carried his cross and went up to the place that is called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew, Golgotha." A bass aria begins the transition to the scene of the crucifixion. Set back in the Passion's original key of G minor and in 3/8 time, the text tells the people to leave their caves of torment and travel to Golgotha. The chorus joins in to repeatedly ask, "Where?" depicting texturally the confusion and agitation of the scene. This is the first aria that breaks the key pattern of descending thirds, and it occurs at the moment of the highest dramatic tension. The patterns of keys used for the arias parallels the uncertainty and agitation of the story, as thirds, while consonant, are a somewhat unstable interval musically. Now that the dramatic action is moving forward in a very determined way, Bach shifts to the much more resolute perfect fourth, representing the inevitability of Jesus' death to come. Scene 2 of the second act depicts the crucifixion of Jesus. First, the location of the crucifixion is described, focusing on the sign placed above Jesus' head, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," to which the crowd protests that it should say that he called himself the King of the Jews. Pilate, unmoved, refuses to change the sign. Bach again interrupts with verse 3 of Valerius Herberger's 1613 chorale, "Wellet will ich dir geben," I want to bid you farewell. The text speaks of one's joy when thinking of Jesus and paints a picture of Jesus dying gently on the cross. The scene continues with the description of the soldiers casting lots for Jesus' robe. The soldiers are portrayed by the chorus, which sings a lively piece in 3/4 time and in C major with multiple points of imitation. Following this, the evangelist explains how this event fulfills prophecy, before introducing the presence of Jesus' mother at the cross. Jesus acknowledges his mother's presence, which is followed by the 9th chorale of the work, verse 20 from Paul Stockmann's Jesu Leiden, Pein und Tod, or Jesus' suffering, pain, and death. This verse offers hope to the individual that God will take care of him or her, as Jesus cared for his mother while he was on the cross. The climax of the Passion crucifixion scene almost certainly occurs in the depiction of Jesus' death. Bach sets this simply, quietly, with Jesus' final words, Es ist vollbracht, or It is finished, set simply to a descending scale in F-sharp minor. The quietness of this moment is striking, demanding not only a dramatic pause, but also reflective commentary, which Bach then provides through a striking 2-part aria. The first part, marked molto adagio, is set for alto, viola da gamba, and continuo. The use of the viola da gamba is again a look backward in musical style, presenting an archaic yet recognizable sound to the congregation. The aria uses a text by Johann Past. First, the alto reflects on Jesus' final words in a slow lament, repeating not only the text, but also the melodic figure that accompanies it. This is Bach at his most emotional and dramatic. Listen for the depiction of pain through the stinging dissonances, especially as he sets the text Die Trauernacht, or Night of Sorrow. The aria changes to a triumphant texture with full orchestra as the alto sings of the hero coming out of Judah with conquering might, before returning to the slow tempo to repeat twice Jesus' final words, Es ist vollbracht. The succession of keys for the arias continues to underscore the dramatic content of the work, as this aria begins in B minor, now a third higher than the previous aria, representing a change of motion from the downward and uncertain to the upward and hopeful. The second part of the aria shifts to D major, a traditionally triumphant key, which is not only a third higher than the beginning of the aria, but also the key of the original aria from Act 1. Bach has, musically at least, returned home. At this point in the Good Friday service, the Passion would have been interrupted for the entire congregation to recite the Pater Noster, or Lord's Prayer, together. A brief transitional recitative by the evangelist leads directly to a second aria, this time for bass. This is perhaps the most complex work of the entire Passion. Bach sets a text from Brachus's Passion that asks whether Jesus' death has made the individual free from death and worthy of redemption, to which Jesus responds, yes. While the bass sings this text, the chorus sings the final verse of Stockmann's Jesu Leiden, Pein und Tod, creating a texture like a chorale prelude. a piece that represents a chorale melody over free ornamentation, elaboration, and expansion over its musical materials. Bach stays in the key of D major, the ending key of the previous aria, for the setting of this text. Bach then departs from the Gospel of John for the second time, inserting again a section from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verses 51 through 52, which describes an earthquake that occurred upon Jesus' death. Again, Bach's motivation for adding these story elements from Matthew is unknown, although these details would have been familiar to a congregation of his time. As commentary on the earthquake scene, Bach adds two arias. The first, set in common time in G major for tenor, expands on the dramatic significance of the earthquake, depicting its theological symbolism. In this movement, Bach recreates the shaking of the earth through string tremolos. The use of G major represents a return to the home key of the entire work. A second aria for soprano, flutes, oboes, and continuo follows, commenting on the action that has just passed. Dissolve my heart in floods of tears to honor the highest. Tell the world and heaven the anguish, your Jesus is dead. The key of this aria seems to break the narrative established earlier in the work. The aria is set in F major, which is a key traditionally associated with calm, relaxation, and peace. It represents the acceptance of what has occurred. The scene concludes with a depiction of the soldiers breaking the bones of the others who were crucified with Jesus, but not Jesus' bones, and the piercing of Jesus' side in order to fulfill prophecy. A final chorale, verse 8 from Michael Weiss's 1551, Christus, der uns selig macht, or Christ who makes us blessed. The final scene of the Passion consists of three pieces. The first is a simple setting of the book of John, chapter 19, verses 38 through 42, sung solely by the evangelist who describes the taking of Jesus' body to its burial site. The second is a choral setting of another section of Brachus's poetry. This piece serves as a counterbalance to the opening chorus. It is in C minor with a similar ABA form. The text summarizes the promise of the Christian resurrection story, that Jesus' grave opens the doors of heaven for those who follow him. A final chorale, verse 3 of Martin Schalling's 1571, Herzlich lieb hab dich, O Herr, from my heart I hold you dear, O Lord, brings the work to a close. With the recitation of the traditional postlude blessing, the Lord bless you and keep you, the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. The Good Friday service would then have concluded. Following Bach's death, the St. John Passion was performed one more time in Leipzig in the early 1750s before disappearing into obscurity. The score was one of many works that appears to have been handed down to one of two of Bach's students, Johann Philipp Kernberger or Johann Friedrich Agricola, possibly through Bach's eldest son, Carl Philipp Emanuel. Upon their deaths, the score appears to have been then handed down to Carl Friedrich Zelter, an alumnus of the St. Thomas School, who was also the director of the Berlin Singakademie, a choral group in which noted Romantic composer Felix Mendelssohn participated in his youth. Mendelssohn discovered the score for the St. Matthew Passion in the Singakademie's files and became interested in the music of Bach, leading to the resurrection of the St. Matthew Passion in 1829. This reignited an interest in the music of Johann Sebastian Bach in general, which led to the publication of some of his larger choral works, among them the St. Matthew and St. John Passions in 1830 in vocal score format. The St. John Passion was, apparently to Mendelssohn, a work of lesser quality, as he showed little interest in performing it. Zelter's successor at the Berlin Singakademie, Carl Friedrich Rungenhagen, is the first to program a revival of the work in a highly modified form in 1833, followed by its publication in full score the following year. Romantic performances of the work generally removed difficult sections and rearranged and reorchestrated others to accommodate contemporary instruments and to balance the work for the larger choruses and orchestras that were the style of the time. Performances of the St. John Passion became more common following Robert Schumann's publication of a 7-part essay on the work and subsequent performance in the 1850s. Nevertheless, its role seemed to consistently be as a bridge piece for choral societies wishing to establish their reputations by performing the major works of Bach. First, they would perform the St. Matthew Passion. In a subsequent year, they would program the lesser St. John Passion, which would lead to a later performance of the greater B minor Mass. The St. John Passion has gradually established its own reputation as a work of incredible power and emotion. Its future, however, remains clouded. First, Bach's instrumentation is problematic for modern ensembles. The use of archaic instruments, even for his time, presents a challenge for ensembles of modern instruments. This challenge is often mitigated by the use of historic instruments in performance. The balance issues between chorus and instruments is also problematic. 19th century ensembles struggled mightily with this issue, and once again the revival in historic performance practices seems to have mitigated some of these issues. Bach's original score was composed for a small chorus in a small space, so his orchestrations reflected this reality. Finally, while the quality of the music and dramatic presentation appear to be timeless, society's evolution toward a more accepting and open view of minority religious groups poses questions about the relevance and appropriateness of the portrayal of the Jews in the story. Some modern conductors have attempted to address this by changing some of the nouns in the text. For example, one conductor consistently replaces the word Juden, Jews, with a noun meaning the people or the crowd. Other ensembles preface their performances with panel discussions about anti-Semitism in the work and in Bach's time. It remains to be seen whether modern adaptations can adequately address the discomfort that many people feel at the characterization of the Jews in the Passion. Finally, the work hasn't always made a smooth transition from liturgical use to the concert stage. It was designed to be a functioning part of liturgy to meet specific requirements of the Lutheran service, so concert performances frequently have the feel of being out of proportion or having a lack of balance between the sections. Some interpreters have addressed this by adding a second intermission, essentially turning a 2-act drama into 3 acts. Nevertheless, the St. John Passion remains to this day a work of intense power and beauty, depicting one of the central stories of Christianity in a very affective way. The work continues to grow and to be adapted for musical and theological relevance in modern performance.